Okay, we're back for another episode of the Melillo Method podcast, Everything Brain, with Dr. Peter Scire and I. Really, the reason why we're here is because Peter had this idea where he said, hey, we should do something like a podcast. And one of the reasons is because I'd like to kind of interview you, meaning talk to me about, ask me questions and kind of bring out information. So that's kind of the impetus to it, and this is kind of that episode. So I'm going to now kind of leave it off, and you take the lead.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I mean, I think for me, it's always been this situation where I've watched you for 20 years lecture to audiences and lecture to clinicians and other therapists and so on. And these concepts that you throw out are so mind-blowing, but yet probably the general public doesn't get to realize all these concepts. And even though you've written numerous books and they've been bestsellers and everything, but they've been concentrated concepts. They haven't been like these huge concepts that you talk about in the class. So I thought that, this would be the greatest opportunity to do that. So thank you for that opportunity.
Well, thank you for bringing this out, because again, I've been doing this for a long time, and very few people have really appreciated it at the level that you have. And so you're the right person to do this. And I really do want to get this out there to people so that they understand the full scope of what we do.
Yeah, so I guess for me, the starting point would be I meet you in 2004. And the reason why I met you in 2004 was I learned about your formal textbook that you wrote. And it was a mind-blowing textbook that had numerous references, medical references that you made for your statement of like, this is what I believe these developmental disorders are. So can you walk the audience through like, how did that concept come about, and at that particular time for you to sit there and say, hey, I'm going to write this textbook and I'm going to lay down my theory?
Yeah. Well, it started, really with around 1995. I mean, my background was neurology and rehab, and that was my focus of my clinical practice. But I really hadn't looked into things with the kids, and I was even teaching clinical neurology, and there was a lot of new information coming out about the brain, the decade of the brain. This was the 90s, and all brain imaging. So there was a lot of cool things going on, and I was looking at it and starting to teach it. And in the rehab world, you're looking at things that have a lot to do with balance, and so. But really, because of my own kid and some other children that were diagnosed with ADHD, I started really going down that road, really trying to understand. Because for me, the question was, what is it? What's actually happening in the brain? And at that point, I knew a decent amount about the brain, more than probably most, and had all these different tools in which to kind of do it, but hadn't really started looking at a lot of behavioral issues at that point. And so really, kind of started to dive in really with the passion of a father trying to help his son, and somebody who, really early on saw the parents that were struggling with their kids and trying to find an answer. What is happening in the brain in someone with ADHD? What is it? No one can answer that for me. And it was frustrating. I went to different doctors and therapists and people that I was friends with, pediatricians, pediatric neurologists, and said, what's happening in the brain in ADHD? And they looked at me and said, well, I don't know. And I said, somebody's got to know. And they were like, well, somebody may know somewhere, but I don't know it. And they said, well, you can't really change it anyway. And I said, well, that's kind of stupid. Like, how do you tell me that you just told me you don't know what it is, but you're absolutely sure you can't change it? And this is still the thought today.
Could they even give you like an area of the brain that they thought and hypothesized at the time?
They talked, it's something to do with dopamine and something to do with the frontal lobe. That was it. That's the only thing they could say. And why did they know dopamine? Because at the time, Ritalin was the choice.
Yeah.
And around that same time, it was 1995, I was driving into my office one morning and I heard this statistic on the radio that said, from 1990 to 95, the use of Ritalin had increased 250% in the United States, and nobody knew why. So all of this was kind of converging on me, and I was like, okay. But my logical question to me was, what is it? And because how do you change it if you don't know what it is? Or how do you say you can't change it if you don't know? So I really just dove into the research, and it became something of a mystery for me that I needed to solve. And it became almost a little bit of an obsession for a while.
But even that, diving into the research, is not like Google was there in
No,
1995.
no,
And
no.
you could just type in a bunch of words and you'd have thousands of references right there at your fingertips.
No, I started reading books. The first book I read, which somebody told me was Ned Hallowell's Driven to Distraction, which was a big book, still one of the biggest sellers. I've had the opportunity to meet him and talk to him. He's a good guy. We should actually have him on this podcast one time. And he actually mentioned me and our work in his most recent book. But that was the first book, and I started looking at it. But in that book, he talks a lot about his stories, but didn't actually say anything about what ADHD is. And it was frustrating to me. And I was reading different books, and it just wasn't giving me any real info. So I said, I got to go look at the science. So I started going to Stony Brook Medical School Library and Hofstra Library, where they both have medical and psychology departments. Mm-hmm. And I just, on my days off, I would go there. And I would go in the morning and I'd just start pulling journals and pulling papers. And once I found a paper that was really good, I'd start following those references. And then I'd stand, before I left for about an hour or so, I'd stand and I'd copy all these papers off on a copy machine. And then I'd come home and I'd, put them in my office or really in my bathroom so I could read them, or just with me. And I just started doing that, and I was just compiling it.
Now, at the time, was there any particular group of people or researchers that stood out, and you said, okay, I run down this guy's 10 papers or 15? Was it?
Yeah, from the beginning, one of the things that hit me was, when I was trying to do the search, I had this teacher that came into my office that I knew, and she was a elementary school teacher, and she was a family friend. And my first instinct was, hearing that ADHD was being diagnosed so high, my first instinct was, well, it's being overdiagnosed. Like, this is, is it a real thing, And, or was it just a diagnosis, which is what some people say today, and it isn't true. So I said to this teacher, I said to her, this ADHD thing, is it real? And she looked at me, she goes, you have no idea how real it is. So what do you mean? She said, at lunchtime in my school, 50% of our kids line up to get their pill from the nurse, because at that time it had to be given by the nurse.
Yeah, I remember being in elementary school myself, and obviously being a special needs child, and my disorder was different, so I didn't line up and get the ADHD medication. But right. I remember all the children that were in the special education program getting it in a little white cup, and there was their pill, and they took it.
Yeah. And 50% though, and I was like, what? Like, I had no idea about that. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. She goes, no. And she said, you have no idea. It is increasing so much. And she said, I have a lot of my friends that are retiring because they can't take it, because it's just, the classroom is really, these kids are different. It's, really challenging. It's increasing dramatically. And she'd been a teacher for like 30 years. She said, it clearly different. So she said, get a book called Endangered Minds, which was a book that was written by a woman named Jane Healy.
Jane Healy, yeah.
And PhD and educator, again, principal, 30 years. And she started off the book by saying that she would go into the lunchroom of her teachers and she would say, is it possible that kids' brains are different? Like, these kids are not the kids we taught 10 years ago. They're just not. They're different. In some ways, they're really bright and intelligent, but in other ways, they're just really struggling. They can't sit still. And then she went and actually did a survey of like 60,000 teachers, and they all agreed, basically. So once listening to her and reading that, I was like, oh, this is a real problem. So what is it? And so I said to this woman, I said, why do you think this is? And she said, I don't know. It has something to do, though, with, I watch kids when they go on lunch, on recess. They don't move their bodies anymore. She said they sit around and they're not really moving like they used to. She goes, drive down any street. You don't see kids in the street anymore. You don't see them riding bikes and climbing trees, and they're not out there.
Yeah, and it's not like today where, they have a reason why they're not out there. They're on their smartphones and everything.
Right.
But we're talking, early 90s.
Right, when the beginning of like video games.
Yeah, video gaming was
started,
beginning to come. Like,
yeah,
the
and the
Atari
computer
was
and
coming,
personal computer really started to hit its stride, right? And so I said, wow, okay, so she's relating this rise in ADHD to something related to lack of movement.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, this is an area now that I've been researching, right? Because I was looking at rehab and neurology and movement and relating that to the brain and that. And so now it kind of hit me like, wait. So then I started looking at, different research on movement and the brain and brain functions. And then I came across, looking at cerebellar and the cerebellar research like Schmamann and his textbook on learning disabilities and the
because that would have been
cerebellum.
mid-90s. It would have been,
Yeah, and then I started, looking into, Rodolfo Linus's work on looking at timing and, things that we talked about before, but, on looking at the, rhythms of the brain and how that worked, and because functional connectivity and all of that. But then I found the book Brain Asymmetry by Richard Davidson, because at the time we had been looking at the differences in the hemispheres. But what really, early on, the thing that got me is one of the first things I read in the research that really stood out was that whatever paper I was reading, they were talking about that in ADHD, there was this unevenness of skills. And in the whole, what they called attentional behavioral spectrum, which was everything, basically, dyslexia, learning disabilities, ADHD, they said that there was this unevenness of skills where these kids didn't struggle in everything. In fact, they were often exceptional in many ways, like above average, but then they really struggled with other things. And so, again, it hit me like, wow, that sounds like some sort of an imbalance. And in a rehab world, that's like a lot of what we're trying to work with in the body. And so I said, wow, that's interesting. Well, I wonder what kids with ADHD are generally good at and what they struggle at. So I went and found more research on that and started looking at different things. And as I started looking at it, I knew enough about the hemispheres and how they work that I started seeing, wait a second, there seems like there's this pattern where everything they're good at are left hemisphere skills and everything they're struggling at are right hemisphere skills. And I started looking at it saying, wow. And I thought, it can't be that easy, right? It can't be that straightforward, right? This is going to fall apart as I move forward. So as I started going forward, and I started really thinking about and looking at research on behavior and on attention and on learning. And at that point, attention now was probably the single most studied thing in all of psychology. And, so research on attentional mechanisms, what was happening in the brain, and it was taking me to the cerebellum and the thalamus and the brain and the frontal lobe and all of those things, and differences between right brain attention and left brain attention. And, I started going down and started looking at other aspects of behavior and learning disabilities and dyslexia. And dyslexia was the exact opposite model, where right brain deficits and left brain advantages seemed to be ADHD. Dyslexia was the opposite. And that research, going back to Galiberta and Gershwin in Harvard, in like the late 70s, early 80s.
And then some of the early work that your research partner, Dr. Leisman, was doing in the late 70s as well.
Yeah, and looking at dyslexia and looking at these anatomical differences and brain asymmetry. And then I started looking at more and more different types of behavior in different parts of the brain and how it regulated memory and concentration and focus and planning and organization and executive functions, and every step of the way it fit this model. And then I started looking at sensory and difference between gross motor and fine motor, and looking at eventually even things like immune system, like that they seem to have an overactive immune response and underdeveloped thing, and looking at the way the right and left brain regulate immune system. So it just every step of the way it led to new papers and new discoveries and new information that just seemed to, really at a certain point, I was like, okay, this is real. This is what's happening. This is really the problem. And I realized that a lot of people weren't looking at it this way.
Mm-hmm. And then that led to you to then designing the 10 principles of your model. And so you want to kind of expand on that and what those original 10 principles were?
At a certain point, several years in, I did two things. One is I started using some of this information to try to help my own son and some other kids. Started saying, okay, I think I have some sort of an ideal, so let's start doing things to see if we can change the brain. And I started getting results right away, like really impactful results right away, on kids that had been like medicated for years and nothing really helped them. So I knew I was onto something, but I'd also been compiling these papers, and they were all in my den on the floor. And like some of the papers were, 2-3 feet high, right? And my kids were little then. My youngest was probably only like, maybe 4 or 5 at the time, and 2 or 3 maybe even. And I would go in the room every once in a while and look at these papers. And at that point, I had about 3,000 to 4,000 papers in different piles lined up. And I would just look at them. And I knew that the complete answer was there in those papers. But it was still a little overwhelming because it's a lot of information, and there were books. And and this was in my library, so I had a library with hundreds of books that I'd read. And so my wife would come up to me and say, "What are you going to do with these?" And I'd say, "I'm going to put it together someday." And she'd say, "Well, you got to get it out of here because the kids are running through here. They knock it over, and you just get rid of them." And I was like, "I don't touch them. They're going to do something, right? I don't know what yet." So at some point, I went in there. I remember one night I was like, "That's it. I got to write this. I got to write it." So I just decided. I said, "Listen, I'm going to take 6 months. I'm going to write this." And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, slow down my practice for a while, and I'm just going to write. And my wife was like,
and at that point,
okay.
you've never written anything. You
No,
just
never written anything.
Term papers in college
Nothing.
and stuff.
Right,
Okay.
nothing. People say to me, "How did you know how to write? Your first textbook was about the brain, and how did you know how to write? Did you take course?" I was like, "No." And they're like, "How did you know?" I said, "Well, I read a lot of books. I'd read so many textbooks that it just was in my head. I knew what I had to do." And so that's when it came over me, like it was really weird. And I realized that when I started looking at these stacks and I started organizing it into chapters, I realized I had subconsciously organized these papers into chapters. There was the cerebellum chapter, there was the basal ganglia chapter, there was the evolution chapter, and I was like, oh my God, I literally mapped out the book here. And I didn't even realize I was doing that. And then what I would do is I would just take a stack of those papers, go to the library, and just run through it, write, put down the reference, and just write. And I did that. And, 6 months later, I had literally handwritten, because I couldn't type at that point, 1,300 pages.
Wow.
Handwritten 1,300 pages. It was crazy. It was like this manic thing that I did and I went through like 4,000 papers and books as references. And that was really the end of it. All that happened about 1999.
And so you start working with these kids, you start seeing the progression of the results that you're getting. What happened next? So now you put the book together, and you're saying, okay, hey, I have this book. It goes out, and it's time in the neurology world. It was just something that, hey, Dr. Melillo's coming out with this book.
Right.
Go publish it. And that was my first, time ever hearing your name. I had heard about someone that was working with kids and doing some interesting things, and then I'm assuming from there you said, okay, I'm going to take the book and take some of these results, and you started teaching. Is that kind of the order of how it happened?
Yeah, I was looking for answers. And when I wrote that book, it did exactly that. I mean, I came away from this, I saw it so clearly what the problem was, and I saw the solution. I mean, it all came together with me because I was so immersed in it. It's so intensely. And I knew at that point that I probably knew more than almost anybody in the world at that point because, I'd just written a 500-page textbook. Eventually, I never really thought it would get published, but it did get published by the number one publisher in neuropsychology in the world called Kluwer, and because of the help of my research partner, Jerry Leisman. But it was all about creating a program. It was all about making a difference. So I'd started now really aggressively working with kids and people in my practice. And we started, like I said, seeing really great results, not only in my own son, but in many, many other kids. And so I started putting together, and immediately, because I'd already been teaching a lot, I thought in terms of, I need to teach this. Mm-hmm. So how do I teach it? How do I understand it in the way that I can teach it? And that's also partly why I wanted to put a book together. And because, a lot of the courses that were being out there and taught in functional neurology, no one was giving scientific references or really backing up anything they said. And so, as I started going out there, then someone approached me, soon around that and said, do you want to teach a course on this? Because we're hearing you're getting good results and a lot of people are interested in this. And I said, yeah, okay, that's cool. Because my mission was, I have an answer here and I know that nobody else is seeing this like I'm seeing it. And so I have a responsibility to get it out there. I have to get it out there. So what's the best way? I have my practice and I'm seeing it, but that's only impacting small population. This needs to be out there because we're facing an epidemic of childhood issues, because now it only increased. And I saw that coming. I mean, when that woman told me that, I said, this is only going to get a lot worse, and it has. And then it extrapolated out into all things like autism and everything like that. And then we developed a program and started teaching it. But then, I realized that we also needed to really do research. We needed to actually prove it. We need to do outcomes research. We needed to show, not just saying, oh, yeah, I get these results and this is the concept. The book gave me kind of this, shield that said, okay, this is where the theories come from. So that people could say, well, okay, all right, well, this is impressive, but show me your results. And that's where, I realized we really need to start doing some heavy research.
And I think the leap came when, obviously, in 2004, I meet you. We start collaborating, and you know how interested I became in your work, and I consumed it so much. And so the next thing was, all right, could someone outside of you duplicate
exactly
the results that you were getting? And the handful of clinicians at the time that, probably really said, okay, I'm gonna invest so much into this Melillo gentleman and learn his work. They went out and were able to reproduce it. But I think I was probably the one that went to a whole other level in terms of reproducibility. And then that's how we ended up, starting the one business together. And so, but even when we did that, the goal was, okay, we're going to get these results and be able to do it in a child with autism or do it in a child with ADHD or learning disability. But the goal always was about the research. Like, how can we continue to show that this is a reproducibility? And so fast forwarding from 2004 to that gap of 2009, then I think for me, one of the best papers that you had written at that moment was the autism paper, where you really defined the concept on a higher level than that you went into the book. So the title of the book was Autism Spectrum as a Functional Disconnection Syndrome.
Right. Yeah, what we wanted to do was, as I was going along the road, I in the textbook, I think I had the understanding of what was the underlying, this problems with balance of synchronization and coordination and issues in the hemispheres, and then how does it happen? And then I put it into a developmental perspective, showing it wasn't really injury, it was something that was affecting in development, and then started relating that in that development as well. When you have kids in this world, especially in the autism world, there was a lot of controversy where there were people like Martha Herbert coming out and saying that, no, these kids with autism that have digestive problems and leaky gut and immune issues and biomedical issues and all of the biomedical stuff that was evolving in the functional medicine aspect, the traditional medicine was saying, well, that had nothing to do with the psychology or the neuropsychology or the learning issue or the behavior issue. That's the physical body, and that is completely separate from what is happening behaviorally. And that never made sense to me. And so I started looking for those links more and more, and started then looking at, the regulation of the autonomic system and the immune system and the research on the right and left brain and how it regulates the immune system and how that relates. And as I said, that's all those pieces started to fold together, and really expanding the model from initially doing like physical exercises and like adjustments or different things, and then now adding dietary changes and supplements, and then also adding cognitive-based activities and to improve learning and reading and memory and all those things, to really hit all of these things, and using sound and light and putting it all together. And I wanted to come up with something that really was a universal theory that said, how do we explain all of the symptoms that we see in autism? And we chose autism, even though we were working more with things like ADHD and dyslexia and learning disabilities, because autism was like the ultimate mystery. That was like in science and in neuroscience, clinical neuroscience, that was like the holy grail. Like, nobody really understood that. That was really intimidating. It was really most people looked overwhelmed at it. Like, I have no idea. This is almost impossible for anybody to understand. So that's why, for me, I knew if I could understand that and I could change that, then everything else was going to be relatively easy. And so I wanted to come in because, I'd go to conferences and, big conferences in autism, and one room a person would speak about B12 deficiencies, and another person would talk about, motor problems, and another person would talk about auditory processing, and another person would talk about hyperactivity, another person would talk about tics. And they didn't link any of it together to anything. It just was this mishmash. And I said, there's got to be this model that links it all together. And I think I've come up with that model. And that's what that paper was about. It was about basically saying, and actually one researcher, one person, when they, published it, they actually said, this is the first universal theory of autism that I've ever read that really ties everything together. All of the psychological, the neurological, the learning issues, the motor issues, the sensory issues, the imbalances of those, and then couples it with the biomedical issues. And we showed that basically every biomedical thing at that time that was known, things like leaky gut or, detoxification problems or anything, lack of digestive enzymes or not enough acid or not B12 methylation problems, all of those things, you could explain them by an imbalance in the right and left brain and in the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And that could explain everything. And that was, a big accomplishment because it really kind of brought, because I hadn't gone into my textbook that much on the neuroimmune or the autonomic part that much. And that really brought that world into it and really completed the model.
Because the prevailing theory of autism at that time, or let's say early 2000s and going back, was mostly that it was a behavioral issue.
Yeah, there really wasn't really good theories as to what was happening in the brain. It was that, some people had concepts that it was brain injury of some sort. Of case, everybody thought it was a genetic mutation, which it's not. And so there really weren't a lot of great ideas, because some kids had problems where they had verbal issues. Some people said, okay, well, it's a verbal left brain language problem. Other people, like in the Asperger's world, it was literally referred to as right brain autism because they were perfectly verbal but were on the autism spectrum. And so there really wasn't a clear thing. Like nobody had really, even now, really come out and said, why can't these kids speak?
Yeah.
What really actually prevents that? And again, why do they have gut problems? And then the people in the biomedical world knew nothing about the brain, like literally nothing. So they believed it was all in the gut and it all started with that, or it was because the genes for DNA methylation, or it was biochemical, and it was inflammation in the brain. But it didn't really explain what you saw behaviorally, where again, kids with autism, they have certain areas of their brain that were incredible.
Yeah,
that
the
were
savant
really
syndrome
strong.
that we see.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we were doing the imaging in the brain at the time we started it, we could see that certain areas of the brain were overconnected and really superhuman fast, and then other areas were underconnected. And that didn't make sense if it was this massive metabolic issue, because, why would, if it was a toxin thing or if it was something due to a metabolic problem that affects the whole body, or a genetic thing that's going to affect, large neurotransmitter systems, why would it affect certain areas where it makes it actually function better than normal, like at superhuman speeds, and then in other areas in the brain on the other side make it function at really slow, really low levels with no actual injury? So that's the thing. When you looked at the brain and imaged the brain, there's no injury, there's no pathology in the brain. There's no genetic mutation, so that's where the mystery comes in. People had no idea what it was or what was causing it, and had no real concept that really explained it all. And you had people thinking at it purely biochemically, which is obviously in the medical world, that's where they felt comfortable. And then you had other people in the psychology world looking at it as a psychology problem, and people in the education looking at it as an education and behavior problem. And then you had people in the, sensory motor physical world looking at it as a motor coordination or muscle or sensory processing issue, when it was really all those things, but no one had ever put it all together.
And the research at the time starts converging on the concept of functional connectivity and the idea of intrahemispheric connections versus interhemispheric connections. And what you're saying is that in a child with autism is that we may see an abundance of intrahemispheric, or these very local discrete pathways that are more dominant at the expense of the interhemispheric pathways, or as well as the opposing hemisphere having a lack of those intrahemispheric pathways. That's the basis.
Yeah, and that kind of fit in with what I'd come up with, because again, I was looking at, okay, well, what causes it all? Like, what's the problem? And I came up with the idea that it was just a developmental delay, that it was the delays in cortical maturation, which was where some of the research was going in ADHD and in autism, that there wasn't any damage, but what you could explain was there was something happening in development. And so as the brain matures, something was going off the rails. And again, in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, how they developed. And so that's when I started looking at, how does that happen, and realized that, okay, and how does the right brain become the right brain, and how does the left brain become the right brain and left brain, and how do they do different things, and why is that important, and why is that an advantage, and how does that go awry? And started realizing that, the right brain develops first. And I found research that talked about, okay, so the right brain really takes the lead in development in the womb and for the first 2 to 3 years. And then the left brain kicks in, and then the left brain takes the lead. Difference by, I'm talking 20 or 30%. They're both growing. And so that really triggered this is what forms the basis of the right brain and its skills, and the basis of the left brain and its skills, and that timing in the brain and whatever, is related to that timing, that's where things can go awry. That's where if you have, let's say the right brain doesn't develop over the first 2 to 3 years, but let's say it's 3 to 4 years, and the left brain comes online too late, that could be dyslexia. Or if you have a problem where the right brain is supposed to develop first, but it stops, or something stops it, and then the left brain kicks online too early, then that, could be autism. And so I started thinking about that and looking at how that relates, and how the brain develops, and the idea that the brain develops from the bottom up, from the bottom of the brainstem, and then builds up to the top, and then the brain builds, and then it comes down and regulates top, and that what we call vertical integration. And then there's also horizontal integration. And then, so the brain, as it matures, it becomes differentiated. The right and left brain become more and more different. The right and left brain become, faster. But also what needs to happen is the brain needs to become more synchronized with maturity. And a lot of what's driving this is that distribution of exactly what you're talking about, the local short-range connectivity versus long-range connectivity. So the research was showing, and later our research showed, that like in something like autism, we start off with these short-range connections that connect these hubs and these networks and are very fast and efficient. And then as these networks build, at a certain point with maturity, you have to lose some of the short-range connection and develop long-range connections that start connecting the networks together, especially longest range between the right and the left hemisphere. The analogy I use is that, most of the United States are small neighborhoods, and we have small little roads that drive through any town. And if you're going to go from one side of your town to the other, you're going to take these little roads, and you go boom, 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 and it's fast and it's efficient. But if you have to go to another part of your state and you take those side roads of every little town, it's going to take forever. So you jump on a highway, and the highway are the long-range connections that then really quickly take you from one area or neighborhood to another. And that's what happens. In networks, we have these things called hubs, and they're like little neighborhoods, and they work together, and they're very interconnected with short-range connections, and it's short and efficient, and they're fast, and they're powerful, right? They're slow and they're powerful, actually, but they are really connected. But at a certain point, you need to be able to link, distant parts of the brain together. And the most advanced parts of the human brain are the furthest apart from one another. So you need to develop really fast ways of getting them connected. So you have to get rid of some of those short-range connection, and very strategically in the brain, and there's a very precise algorithm for this, which is amazing actually when we think about how the brain and was developed and everything, that you have to have just the exact amount of long-range connections to short-range connections, and this is the basis of what we look at graph theory, right? Mm-hmm. Figuring that out. And that showed that in kids with autism and ADHD and all of them, that there were too many short-range connections and too little long-range connections, so it made their brain slower, less efficient, but it was also different from the right hemisphere to the left, and mainly those connections between the hemispheres were the most compromised and delayed. Not damaged, but just smaller and delayed. And that was really all a byproduct of a brain that was more immature. It was slower. It was, connected differently, and it was not synchronized as well. And certain areas were actually more advanced, and other areas were really slower than others.
And at the same time that this explosion in connectivity research is happening, and the imaging research, then we discover some major players in the right hemisphere, being specifically this particular cortex called the insular cortex. Okay. And also, we discover that within this cortex, there's these von Economou cells, and that Arcaboni referred them as mirror neurons. So, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah. So, looking at again how do you explain the symptoms of something like autism, which are pretty consistent. Meaning, even though every child is different, there are certain clear similarities that they all have a certain amount of like tics or stimming behavior. They have OCD behavior. They have hyperactivity behavior. They have advanced skills. Many of them read early, like they're hyperlexic. And they may very early on be attracted to things like numbers and letters and symbols and start looking at books, even when I had one kid that could read at 8 months old. And many of them have some level of communication deficit. Some of them, about half of them, may have a verbal communication delay, but almost all of them have more nonverbal communication. And really, the overall theme is that they have really, in the right brain, they have this underdevelopment of their attachment, their social development, their emotional regulation, all of this right brain stuff, the ability to read emotions on other people, and the ability to understand it, theory of mind, those concepts of being able to interrelate to people were underdeveloped, and then the areas of the left brain were really more overdeveloped and overactive, and that also related into the immune system, that the left brain activates the immune system and the right brain inhibits the immune system. And it goes back to this kind of approach and withdrawal functions of the right and left brain. And so all of this was pretty consistent, but where did it all really link together? What was the link? Like, how did this come together? And again, one of my main questions was, why don't certain kids speak? I mean, no one really answered that. Even now, no one really has answered it. But a lot of people were thinking, well, the verbal kids, if they're not speaking, it's because there's a verbal language problem. Mm-hmm. But yet, there didn't seem to be anything that you could see that was a problem. And if anything, that area of the brain was over-connected. And then there came a concept of, it's an apraxia thing, which is a left brain thing where they have motor planning problems and apraxia, and they literally can't move their mouth very well, or they can't coordinate the movement. Okay, that could explain some of it, but what didn't get me was that verbal language is a left brain function, and in most kids, in all kids with autism, their left brain functions are advanced. I mean, literally, every person I think that I've ever dealt with autism, non-syndromic autism, is a genius with their left brain. I mean, their left brain is phenomenal, and they have, like the classic Rain Man symptoms, right? They can do numbers in their head. Their memory for details is incredible. They can do calendar counting, some of them. Like I said, they might read before the age of 2 or even 1. So if all their left brain skills are so good, why would one of the main functions of the left brain, verbal language, be so bad? And it didn't make sense to me. And why would their motor planning be so bad? Since many kids with autism, their motor planning for like fine motor skills is unbelievable. So where their right brain was really delayed. And then I started hearing and really getting some input, and I started reading books by people with autism that couldn't speak. And I remember in 2002, there was this woman who had her son, she was from India, and his name was Tito. And she had developed this technique called RPM, Rapid Prompting Method. Her mom had told me about it, of an autistic kid. And it was interesting. And they were using a letter board for the kids to communicate. And so they came over here, and Mike Merznick, who's a researcher who I'd followed from the beginning from San Francisco, he and another guy named Eric Corcanese, two big researchers at that time that were like really rock stars to me. They were studying this kid because they wanted to understand why he couldn't speak, right? And so I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. And so in 2002 in the New York Times, there was an article on this kid. And in it, he made a statement. He, typed it because he could communicate through typing. And he could relate what he felt and why he couldn't speak when he was younger. And he said, my earliest memory was 4 or 5 years old. I was in India, and I didn't know I had a body. I couldn't feel my body. The only time I felt my body is if I was under a shower or if I got hungry. He said, but otherwise I didn't know I had a body. I didn't feel like I existed. And he said part of the reason why I flapped my body and rocked my body was because during those moments when I was moving, I could feel my body a bit. And for those moments, I felt like I existed. Otherwise, I didn't know if I was a real person. I didn't feel embodied. And I thought about that and I went, wow, okay, that's a really interesting concept, because that fits perfectly with a right brain deficit, because the right brain is where we feel our body, initially feel our body, where we develop a map for our whole body. And if they don't feel their body, then you can't move your body. You can't plan a movement with a part of your body that you don't know where it is. You don't feel it. So then I started reading other books by people like him, and it was all the same thing. They all said the same thing. I couldn't feel my body. I couldn't control my body, but I knew everything, right? Like all the words were there. That, again, the verbal, it wasn't a cognitive verbal deficit. It was really this sensory deficit. And so I started looking at what part of the brain would do that, and then looking at what's called interoception. And interoception, there was a book that came out by Blakesley's, which was a book that talked about the body has a mind of its own. And it was a whole book really about the insula, the right insula in particular. And that was really where we connect with our body. The mind-body connection was really, physically regulating our body, feeling our body. And that was the area.
Like gut feelings.
Like gut feelings, intuition, empathy, but also even feeling our feelings, right? So the right brain develops first, as we said. And right from the beginning, a child needs to be able to non-verbally communicate to their parents that when they're in pain, when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, when they're tired, when they need to be changed or go to the bathroom, and smell and taste have a lot to do with that, and if they're hot and if they're cold. So these basic sensations are more felt in the right brain and primarily in the right insula. And so these early feelings, these early sensations are what also help them attach and also give them a reference so that they start understanding what those feelings look like in other people. And that is the basis of nonverbal communication and ultimately things like empathy. Like, for instance, if you don't feel pain, you can't understand someone else's pain fully. And so what I started realizing was most kids on the autism spectrum, or especially on the non-speaking end of it, had really poor interoception. Like they didn't feel their body, like this kid described. Like they didn't feel it. And then research was coming out saying that they had something going on in their insula. And there were studies that showed that people that, there's a thing called a heartbeat perception test, where they do studies where people sit in a chair and they ask them, okay, we're going to play in your ear a sound. And the sound's either going to be in sync with your heart or asynchronous with your heart. And you need to tell us and push a button when it's synchronous with your own heart. And these people would sit there and they would change it up and they would press the button when it was synchronous with their heart and then not when it's synchronous. And then they measured this and they looked at this and they saw that some people were really good at it, like they were right on. When the beat was equal to their heart, other people were completely off. And then the people that were really synchronous, that could understand their own heartbeat perception, the area of their brain that was larger was the right insula. And those were the people that scored highest on tests of empathy. They could read other people better. Mm-hmm. So they were more in touch with their own body, and they could be more in touch with other people's feelings and emotions. And that one of the things that was unique about the right insula was the presence of these von Economo cells, which are some of the biggest cells in the human brain. They are some of the latest to show up in evolution, and only humans in the highest level of primates have them, and that in child development, they're the latest cells to really show up at about 4 years of age, and that in the right insula, there's about 30% more von Economo cells than in the left insula. And they have something to do with feeling our body, but also with self-awareness, becoming self-aware, becoming embodied, understanding that you're a separate individual person, which is one of the unique features of the human brain and human consciousness, is that we are self-aware. I mean, the name Homo sapiens sapiens means the wise man that knows he's wise. And so self-awareness is probably the most unique aspect of our intellect. And that comes from that area of the right insula. And so looking at this in autism, it really started coming together, and I started believing that that's why they don't really speak. And that's what we have to change to get them to speak. But it really also has to develop the nonverbal communication first, because that's the foundation. And it's all in that right brain that we have to do that. And that is where we also started realizing that there's also a relationship to the autonomic system and the immune system.
Mm-hmm. And when you started going through that new research, not only did we look at this insular cortex, but then we began to understand more of the integration that occurs between the parietal lobe, the insular cortex, and the vestibular system. And one of the main symptoms that we see with many of the children with developmental disorders is this relationship of body awareness. Where is the body in space and time? Many of the children, when we assess their vestibular system, they tend to either have a hyperactive vestibular system where they're over responding to the vestibular input, or in most instances probably hypo.
Yeah,
under response.
Yep.
And so we now understand that there seems to be this association cortices where these different parts of the brain are integrating together, collaborating together, called the PIVC.
Yes. Yeah, so, as we talked about, the basic sensations of things like pain and hunger and thirst and temperature, which we know in most kids on the autism spectrum, on the lower end of it, on the higher end of it, they may be hypersensitive to those things. So there's a mechanism of that. But either way, it's still the same underlying problem. It's just the level of kind of maturity and perception. And so the basic sensations we know are there. But then there's also, like you said, there's a big issue with in development and in that vestibular system, that inner ear system, right? Some people that work in the sensory processing world for years have known, working with the vestibular spinning kids, doing things like that may help kids.
It goes back to the early work that Jane Ayers did.
Exactly. So, but where in the brain is that happening? And there is an area called the parietal insular vestibular cortex. So it's connected to the insula. So the insula is an area of the brain that's deep down in the brain, in the cortex, kind of towards the inside of the cortex, of the layers. And on one part of it, it connects to the parietal lobe, another part connects to the frontal lobe, and another to the temporal lobe. And so it plays a role in all of those three things. Like the frontal insula is really where we become more self-aware and empathy, right? Okay. So higher level, like understanding what other people are thinking, right? But the vestibular center is in that right parietal insula area, and that it's where we kind of get our sense of gravity and balance and spatial relationship. But early on also, it's what creates a map. So as we're moving through the world, as we're little children moving through the world as babies and then toddlers, we're creating a map in our brain, in our parietal lobe, of our body. So we're literally creating a physical map called a homunculus. Mm-hmm. And the right brain has a map for both sides of the body, a sensory map. The left brain only has one for the right half. So the right brain is more about developing this map of our body, of where it is in space, and then also where it is in relationship to other things around it. So the spatial awareness, so visual spatial. We know that the right brain is the spatial brain, and sense of gravity and all of these things. And that the primary area for that, so there's a left parietal insula and there's a right, but the final processing is in the right, in that same insula area, right, which is connected. So not only do we develop this kind of internal map with interoception of where our body is and our feelings, but also this external map of our body and proprioception, so where our body is in space, and then kinesthesia, where it is related as we move through the world. And that gives us, that's how we become embodied. That's how we know, oh, I have a body. Like that kid said, I didn't know I have a body. Yeah. We have a body and we know where it is and we can feel it and we become bodied and we realize that I'm me and you're you. So I'm different from you. So we have kids, that's when around 2 years of age, when a child recognizes themselves in the mirror, they get mirror recognition and they say, okay, I am a separate individual, and they have what we call body ownership, and then they can develop agency. They can start actually controlling their own behavior. Mm-hmm. And so that right area with that, there was this overlap of all of it.
And that urgency that they're able to create, especially in the children that are more development delayed, we see where a lot of times they cannot control their bowel movements, and it's so hard for their parents to begin to even potty train them. And is it there because of a recognition that, hey, when I have to urinate, I get these signals that my bladder is filling up. But if that sensory perception or the sensory input coming in is not being perceived by that insular cortex because of underdevelopment, how am I going to know that, hey, I need to go to the restroom?
Right. And that's what we see. I mean, we've done thousands and thousands and thousands, and I do these histories every day, and I work with these kids every day, and I ask them all these questions. And what we see consistently, especially on the end of the kids that aren't speaking, is that they have an extremely high pain threshold, right? Some kids, I mean, one kid literally broke his humerus in half. He went in an ambulance, didn't cry.
Yeah, we draw blood on these children and they don't react to a needle.
We know that they often, have really altered feelings of hunger. Like they don't necessarily, they may not feel hungry at all, or they may not feel full. So we have some kids that just eat and eat and eat and eat and throw up, and then, they don't feel it. Again, this is interoception. A great example, great story of this is like hunger and thirst. I had this 14-year-old kid from Puerto Rico, and I was talking to mom about this, and she said, it almost looked like I always thought my son was constantly thirsty because he drank so much water. Then I realized that this is too much water for any human to drink. Like, he's not feeling full when he drinks. And she said to him, you drink too much water, only drink when you're full or when you're thirsty. And he looked at her and he said, how do I know when I'm thirsty? Which is a perfect example of what do you mean? Because the right brain, we know, develops, again, primarily in the first 3 years, and it's subconscious. We don't remember what we learn, and we don't know if we didn't learn it. And so all the things that we think everybody knows, everybody knows when they're thirsty, everybody knows when they're hungry, everybody knows when they're in pain. What do you mean you don't know you're in pain? And then looking at right brain emotions, what do you mean you don't know when you're sad, right? Sure. Or you're happy, or, any of those things. We read this one book recently by this kid, non-speaking autism, and he talked about how sometimes he gets really emotional, but he doesn't know what emotion it is. So he doesn't know if he should be angry or because he doesn't know. He's feeling something, but he can't identify the emotion because we learn those things early on. Again, through parent interaction and everything as we develop. So all of this develops in that right brain, this connection to our body, this awareness, this ability to tell, am I happy, am I sad? Do I feel something? And all of that then we use to read on other people, and that's how we use to interact with them. And if we don't feel our body, if we don't connect to our body, we can't regulate our emotions, and we may have, dampened emotions. So we see that they often, many times, like you said, they don't feel when they have to go to the bathroom. So, or they only notice it after the fact. So they may be really delayed in their potty training. Again, they may be really clumsy and awkward with some of their movements because they don't know where they may not know where their body is in space overly. They often don't feel temperature. Yeah. I had a kid one time from Florida, and he was up with us in New York, and it was February, and his parents said, when in Florida in the summer, the pool deck around their pool was burning hot, and this kid could walk on the deck and not bother him. And while they were up in New York, they did an Airbnb, and it was freezing. It was February. He would run out in the backyard. He'd get out in the backyard, no sense of danger, again, which is a right brain, so they elope, right? And no sense of fear. And he'd run out in the back with no shirt, no shoes on, and they'd be chasing him down, and he'd be laughing in freezing cold weather. And then as we were working with him midway through the second week, he runs outside and all of a sudden stops, and his eyes get big, and he looks at them, and they realize, oh, he's cold. And they came to me and they said, he just got cold for the first time in his life. He's never felt hot or cold, and he just did it after you've been working with him for only a week.
And then one of the other sensory systems that we see that is fairly delayed is the sense of smell.
Absolutely. So smell and taste are very related to all of this, right? And so, again, when people say to me, well, my child is an incredibly picky eater. They will only eat certain foods. And I'll say to them, well, that means, first of all, they're not hungry. Oh, no, they look like they're hungry. No, they're not hungry. Because if they were hungry, they would eat, right? And they're not feeling hunger. So they can hold out. And they could hold out for days. And that's one of the things, people would say sometimes with kids with autism, well, just, don't feed them and they'll eat. No, they won't. They'll go days without eating because they don't feel hungry and they don't feel thirsty maybe, or they don't feel full and they're overeat, eat and eat and eat till they throw up. And they're also picky eaters because they're not eating by smell and taste. Smell is very important. again, for social development, when we think, I always tell parents, how do animals socialize?
Yep.
They smell one another.
Mm-hmm.
And our area of our brain, the highest evolved area for socialization and attachment, is the orbital frontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
And that in other animals is one of their main smell areas. And that's where we smell and pick up on pheromones. So the highest level of social part of our brain is directly tied to the sense of smell. And this is mostly a right brain function. And most kids that we see, they don't smell things. They literally don't smell it. And a parent, if your child doesn't smell anything, how do you know it? You don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I had one mom, I was working with her kid, and I asked her if he could smell, and she said, I don't know. And then she came to me after I've been working with her child for a while. She said, you know what? I realized that he didn't smell. And she said, and I realized that just changed. She said, all my other boys, he had 3 other boys, they would come into the kitchen when she was cooking, and especially cookies, and they'd go, oh, Mom, you're making cookies. And this one kid never would. And then one day, after we've been working with him for a couple of months, he came in, and he was a non-speaking kid, so now he was speaking. But not only that, he came in and he went, I smell cookies. I want cookies.
Yeah.
And she said he had never smelled it before.
And it was like that story at the time. I remember you telling me this about with the clock. And that one child, the clock had been sitting there in the kitchen for all these years. And the child walks into the kitchen and tells the mom, "Hi, when did we get that new clock?" And she's like, it's always been there,
Right,
so that idea, that spatial relationship. So talking about the orbital frontal, let's take it and merge it into the concept of attachment.
Yeah, well, that's obviously one of my favorite areas. But then when we look at attachment, so what we have to look at also is going back to looking at the development and trying to look at what's the beginning of it all. And how do we change these things? How do we get these kids to speak? How do we get to the core problem? How do we research this? How do we look at this? And that's where, early on in the development, I got to primitive reflexes, right? Because I knew that movement was the key. But what is the foundation of movement? And the foundation of movement are these things called primitive reflexes that we're all born with, that allow babies to move when they don't have control over their movement in that first year. And it leads us through the movement. It engages our senses, and it literally builds our brain. But they're very simple movements. And, in neuroscience, there's a statement, simple movement, simple brain, complex movement, complex brain. We know that, bipedalism is the most complex movement that any animal has ever achieved, and that's what humans do. And we have the most complex brain. Actually, the most complex movement is verbal speech. But it's built on top of all of that. So, looking back and going and looking at there's these things called retained reflexes, and that this alters that developmental stages where, again, almost all the kids that we work with, they have some alteration. They may have low muscle tone. So probably about 85% of the kids that we work with, from the very beginning, they can't latch on and they can't breastfeed. And that's a show that there's low tone and there's immaturity in the brain from the beginning. And to me, that's one of the first things. And then they may not roll over properly, or they do it they're late, or they do it to one side more than the other. Mm-hmm. And then they don't crawl in the way they should, or they're delayed, or they skip it, or they do it in a weird way, or they scoot on their butts. And it should be very specific. And then really, ideally, around 1 year, a child should walk and talk. And most of them never hit those milestones all at the same time in the same way. And so looking at it, saying that they have these retained reflexes and they interfere, they don't go away. And so this holds the brain back and keeps it very in an immature state. And these reflexes come from the lower part of the brainstem, in the medulla. And in the lower part of the brainstem, there's a lot of other nuclei in there. And if the brainstem matures, then the reflexes go away, and then the next stage builds and ultimately build the brain, and we have all the things that a brain should do. But if those reflexes don't go away...
This is what you refer to often as vertical development.
Right, the vertical integration and bottom-up development. And if it doesn't develop from the bottom up, then it's what we call bottom-up interference. And so what's in there also is these autonomic nuclei, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system that regulate the digestive system and, close the gut up that starts out leaky and produces acid and allows us to absorb and digest food and break it down, and also regulates our immune system, as we've talked about. And we're trying to discover how much more that is involved. So looking at that and looking at, this foundation, this is what happens as the right brain is developing first, and that these areas are all directly tied into that area called the insula, because the insula is the main area of the brain that perceives the autonomic system. So this sympathetic and parasympathetic input, the sympathetic goes more to the left insula, and I believe the parasympathetic goes more to the right. And so that insula is that area. So now we're looking at, they don't feel their body. They don't become self-aware to the same level. They don't have body ownership. They don't have this, their vestibular system, as we said, is not, they can't necessarily read other people as well. So the nonverbal communication is poor. But then they have this autonomic dysregulation, so leaky gut. They have too much of the sympathetic. They don't develop the parasympathetic or the vagal system. Everybody knows the vagus nerve. It's really not the vagus nerve. It's not the vagal nerve. It's the parasympathetic nervous system. It's a whole system. And in the left brain and the sympathetic is more inflammation. So we know that these kids have too much inflammation in their body, not enough of the anti-inflammatory system. And then recently, as we know, in the orbital frontal cortex is also where attachment. So all of this is connected. This is what a network now called the central autonomic network, and this is part of the social network that is regulated by attachment as well. And that orbital frontal cortex is really that main seat of it.
And you're alluding to like a lot of work by Alan Shore.
Yes, Alan Shore's great stuff is great. Him, as much as anybody, I think, has really written. And by the way, Alan Shore is a psychologist who is the head of the Geffen Center at UCLA. So, I mean, he's, really well-known academic, mainstream academic. And he's written about attachment and right brain development and right brain function and emotional regulation more than pretty much anybody. But he's compiled all this research that's out there over the years so that it's, really irrefutable, that just a massive amounts of information in the relationship and really identifying many of these connections, like the orbital frontal cortex and the insula. A lot of my work really looking at the neuroanatomy. He's, his stuff and his references have been really instrumental in really putting this all together.
Yeah, and if you want to nerd out on this, I think the paper that you published in 2023 entitled "The Relationship Between Retained Primitive Reflex and Hemisphere Connectivity in Autism Spectrum Disorders," where you really, I personally think, and I told you when you sent me this letter on paper to review, that this was probably your best paper, that you really emerged these concepts in a way that I'd never seen you do it.
Yeah, so like you said, in 2009, we wanted to write a paper that was like putting together the universal theory. Now we wanted to put together a paper that was the universal proof that we could change it, right? Yeah. Like, how do we change it? Mm-hmm. And that's where this whole study that we've been doing the last 4 or 5 years in my lab, this fairly large randomized age-matched controlled double-blind study looking at the relationship between retained primitive reflexes and motor development and autism spectrum, and did, QEEG, looked at the brain with brain imaging and fMRI and a battery of neuropsychological tests in children, adolescents, and adults, and showed that by integrating their reflexes and by stimulating the right hemisphere, we could change it. We could change this in a dramatic way, more than probably anybody's ever shown. And so that's where, it all came together. And in that, what we wanted to talk about was this idea of, the left brain verbal language network, which involves something called, Broca's area, which is a Brodmann area 44 and 45 in the left side of the brain in the frontal lobe, and then Wernicke's, which is Brodmann area 39, 40, and 22 in the parietal temporal lobe, that is Wernicke's area for receptive language. And that there's this connectivity called the arcuate fasciculus. And we know that those areas are hyper-connected in echolalia and scripting. And again, that's one of the things I was like, wait a second. These kids are echolalic and they're scripting, and those areas of the brain are hyper-developed and hyper-connected. Why would that affect their verbal language ability to speak? It doesn't make any sense, right? It had to be something really in the right hemisphere. And so we wanted to compare that to the ability to have nonverbal language, so expressive language, using gestures, facial expression, tone of voice, using it, but then also reading that. So again, in the area on the right brain, the same area that does verbal expressive language on the right is nonverbal expressive language. And then in the right back there, that equivalent of Wernicke's area, which receptive verbal language is receptive nonverbal. So, Broadband area 22 on the temporal lobe, which is for hearing prosodity and hearing tone of voice, and especially emotional tone of voice. And then 39 being able to pick up on body gestures and what do they mean. And then 40 being looking at the face and being able to see facial expressions. And no one had ever really put that all together and really put it into a paper and really defined that and explained it and talked about this is why kids with some forms of autism don't speak. It's a right brain nonverbal language deficit that is revolved around the insula and the parietal lobe, and it's not a verbal language left brain problem, because that makes all the difference as to how you're going to change it. If there's an imbalance between those areas, and we've seen this. We've seen kids, we had this one kid that was coming through our program, and we were working with him, getting great results, and the mom got involved at a laser therapy, meaning a study. And, she had put in for it before she came to us, and it took years, and they were eventually selected for this study. And it was a free study, and they were going to do this laser on these kids with autism to help them speak, right? And I said to her from the beginning, don't do it. This is going to be a mistake because they're going to do the wrong side of the brain. And she said, yeah, I know, but, let me just try it. And so, okay. She came back a few months later, and not only it had not helped his speech, it actually made his tics come out, because what they were doing, they were trying to stimulate the left brain language center, and in doing that, they increased tics, and they increased the OCD, and they increased the self-injurious behavior and the anger and the outbursts, and they didn't help his speech. And they did the opposite, so knowing this is important, because if you're going to change speech, you have to know, again, what you're going to do. And you have to know what areas. And if there's an imbalance, it's going to be you got to be very careful as to what you stimulate and what you inhibit. And that's what we've been focusing on.
Yeah, and with the QEEG work that you've been looking at is the idea that in one side of the brain, you're seeing slower brain rhythms, and then in the other side of the brain, you're seeing these more advanced rhythms that they should be there, but they're hyperactive.
Right.
And that's what that one study showed, whereas that as you improved the developmental integration of these primitive reflexes,
right,
that literally those slow delta theta brainwaves began to disappear, and you saw more emergence of the alpha brain rhythms and the actual beta rhythms on that right side.
And gamma, which is really the cognitive one, right? So the thing about that, the thing that ultimately brought it all together as well is, showing that we can change those brainwave frequencies and that they related to maturity, so that they had slower brainwaves because their brains were immature, and babies have slower brainwaves than adults. And we were able to change that. We were able to mature the brain. We were able to grow it, but in a balanced way where, we could do that. But then overlapping that with, again, that theoretical paper we wrote in 2009 is that all of that was related to the balance of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So what we did, as we measured the brainwaves, we also measured their heart rate variability using EKG. So heart rate variability for people out there means that when we breathe, we have an impact on our breathing rate and on our heart rate. And we need to be in touch with our body. So as we breathe, our heart rate should vary with that breathing. And when our parasympathetic nervous system, this vagal system, is really online and we're really connected to our body, our heart is really, it varies very much with our breathing and with our body. When we don't have the parasympathetic with the sympathetic, our heart rate doesn't vary. It's steady. And people that are in comas they have a very steady heart rate. So having a steady heart rate is not good. You want a heart rate that varies, and what regulates that is the balance of the parasympathetic. So high heart rate variability is related to a high parasympathetic tone. And what we know is that in autism and other developmental delays, especially, they have a high sympathetic tone. And they don't develop the parasympathetic because the nuclei for that is in the brainstem where these primitive reflexes come from. And if the reflexes don't go away, which they never go away in kids with autism unless you make them, then that parasympathetic nuclei doesn't ever fully come online. And that is also regulated by that right insula. And so what we also showed in this study, and this is going to be one of the next papers we're publishing, is that not only could we change their brain waves and speed them up and and reduce their symptoms and improve all of the symptoms associated. But we also changed that balance of parasympathetic and sympathetic, and we were able to increase their heart rate variability and slow down their heart. So there was this direct relationship that we speculated on, that we were able to show that we actually changed it. And this is where you actually made me aware of this term called immunoception, which is so cool, right? So the ability, interoception, the ability to feel your body and the internal organs and everything. And so where in the brain do we perceive the immune response? Where in the brain do we perceive inflammation?
Yeah.
And the autonomic system and the balance of that sympathetic and parasympathetic? Because if there's a rise of inflammation, the brain needs to then respond and cause anti-inflammation. Yeah. And where does that take place? And lo and behold, it's in the right insula.
Yeah.
Which is so cool, right?
Yeah.
Because now it makes, and again, it fits that puzzle that we built so perfectly.
Yeah, because over the years, we've talked about back to the functional medicine piece of this, where people would talk about the leaky gut, the gut dysbiosis, the abnormal digestive enzymes, the vitamin malabsorptions. And so knowing that there's an autonomic component to it, we know that these children have these pro-inflammatory cascades that are happening with increase in specific cytokines activity. But now being able to say, okay, looking at this right hemisphere and saying, if we stimulate into this right hemisphere, can we get better vagal tone, which is going to contribute to the production of the hydrochloric acid, the digestive enzymes, okay, reducing the cortisol release that's breaking down the gut barrier, okay, being able to close the barriers of the gut, so that way we don't have these proteins that are leaking in through and getting into the bloodstream and then causing this immune response that's already heightened and contributing and driving this neuroinflammatory mechanism. And knowing that also with the right hemisphere that we don't get the regulations of the parasympathetic response and getting that anti-inflammatory reflex that Kevin Tracy and his group has so defined over the last 20 years of research.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have heard the term of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. People know of stress hormones like cortisol, right? Or, corticosterone. And people know that has something to do with diabetes. It has something to do with being fat or gaining weight, right, around your belly. And it has something to do with blood sugar regulation and diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And they talk about measuring cortisol and looking at cortisol. They really don't understand what that all means, right? So when we have inflammation in the body, which is primarily generated in large part by the sympathetic nervous system, and as you talked about, there are, and you're kind of the master of talking about these inflammatory cytokines are released, which is needed, right? We need that. We need, and it's some tissue destruction, and we're killing things, right?
Like we get these DAMP responses and PAMP responses.
Right, so we're killing bacteria and viruses, whatever, and it's good. We need that. We need that battle. But then at a certain point, we need to stop it. We need to anti-inflammatory.
Yeah, we need to come to a resolution.
Right. We need to be able, otherwise we're going to keep on killing and killing and killing, and we're going to destroy our own body and our own tissue. So we have to have this anti-inflammatory response. So where does that come from? So that's registered primarily, again, in that right insula. And we perceive, okay, there's too much inflammation. And now through that network, we now activate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and cortisol is an anti-inflammatory chemical.
Yep.
It's basically like you're trying to, like a fire extinguisher. And corticosterone is basically the same as prednisone, right? What's the most powerful anti-inflammatory? They take steroids, and what does it do? So, but we know long-term steroid use, what does it do? It makes you bloat, it makes you put on weight, it makes you, big and round and whatever, it retain fluids and crave carbohydrates, which is what long-term cortisol and corticosterone do. And why would we have so much of those stress hormone responses? Because we have chronic inflammation that's always coming out. So we're always trying to extinguish it, but it's not working, or we're not extinguishing it well enough. And so our right brain isn't activating that anti-inflammatory pathway well enough to overcome that left brain inflammatory pathway. And so we keep on trying to do it, but it doesn't work. And then that's where chronic illnesses come from, and diabetes and cancer and other things can be related to all of that.
So, in summary, right now you're at this point where you started out with this textbook, you developed this model, now you developed an educational model that became the brain balance centers, and now you're in developing this clinical model, the Melillo Method, and you're continuing to treat these patients one-on-one with your team and collecting all this data that I understand that you want to publish. Can we go back to the study that you just did in Cuba for your PhD, and what are some of the other papers that are going to be coming forward relative to that research?
Yeah, well, the most recent paper that should be coming out soon is where we looked at, so with this study, we put these groups through the study with a control group, and then we, looked at the results. And the neuropsychological battery, there was QEEG, so we looked at their brainwave differences, and again, along with that, their heart rate variability. We looked at their fMRI in their brain, so some aspects structurally. And then we looked at their symptoms, and all my research partners were primarily that were collecting the data were neurologists, medical neurologists, and looking at these kids and looking at them physically, examining, looking at their primitive reflexes. And so what we have done is we've shown the paper on the EEG is out. We have other paper on the overall, looking at the data, showing really positive, significant changes.
And that study was published in the British Medical Journal.
Yeah, so there's one on three. We took 3 separate cases, and we published that in the BMJ. That was at the end of 2023 in December. And
one of the best journals in the world.
Right, it's up there with the Lancet in the New England Journal of Medicine. And now what we have just submitted a paper is all the neuropsychological results. So showing the battery of neuropsychological tests and showing a significant difference before and after. And this is only after 12 weeks of intervention, and it was only a home program done by the parents. And then we're going to be coming out with this heart rate variability paper. And then, there's going to be a lot of papers because we have so much data we've collected now. It's a gold mine. So we're just going to be publishing a lot of papers. And as we said, I just sent you the information because I want to piggyback this into where we're going to write a paper that's going to put all this together like this again and really go into that neuroimmune piece and in that immunology world and really understand it from a neurological perspective. People in the neuroimmunology world think that what that looks like is, well, there's all these biochemical factors and immune issues and all these things going on and gut factors and all these cytokines and Th1 and Th2 and all of this happen, and then that all affects the brain, and the brain affects that, right? So there's sophistication on, it affects the brain and the brain affects that. But like, how does it affect the brain and how and what areas of the brain and exactly how that works is still not really mapped out. And that's our goal, is to really do that at the highest level. So again, so that we can add and change it.
Well, I got to say, it's been great getting this first concept of us being able to just sit here and chat and talk about your work. Because for me, my biggest thing that I've always wanted people to be able to hear you on a level like this, to these concepts that are there, but no one's ever integrated them. And you read somebody like Alan Shore's work, or you can read other people's work, but you're the one person that I've ever seen that's taken all these concepts and tried to merge them into a fundamental, bigger concept. And it's been a pleasure of watching this happen over 20-some years.
Well, it's been, a journey that's been great. And you've been, the one kind of person that's been the constant there, that has been the observer to watch this. And I think it's hard for people to really understand the amount of time and work and energy and passion that it takes and the importance of this, because you have to have a certain level of understanding to really understand the importance of it, right? Mm-hmm. I think for me, what really meant a lot to me was, I know that the last couple of years, you've spent so much time studying with, 2 of the best people or giants in the neuroimmune and functional medicine world, right? With who you've studied with, and I know you've put hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hours into that and have become an expert in that area on your own. And that once you did that, then you came back to me and actually kind of had a new appreciation for my approach. and could say that even these guys, as much as you respect them, that they don't know anything about the neurology and how that relates to it. And also more about how do you change it. Like, we have people that we like Alan Shore and, and Ian McGilchrist and people that are writing great stuff out there. And no disrespect, they've put some great stuff out there, but they really don't know how to change it. They understand the system good, and they understand the problem to a certain extent from their limited view. Because if you take a psychologist, he doesn't know anything about the motor system. He doesn't know anything about primitive reflexes. He doesn't know anything about that, right? If you take someone that knows biochemistry, they don't know about physical development. They don't know about psychological development. They don't know anything about the brain. You take a psychiatrist like Ian McGilchrist, he knows a lot about the brain and a lot about the asymmetry and how it relates to psychiatric or psychological or human behavior. He doesn't know anything about the physical body. He doesn't know really much about diet and nutrition or, the biomedicine or anything like that. So I think the ability to put that all together in a way that no one has, from a standpoint of putting it together, is how do you change it? How do you understand why these kids can't speak, and then how do you change it? That, I think, has been the course of my career, and you've been able to sit back and watch that. And I think, knowing that, because you know that part of the immunology and the functional medicine better than me because you've dove into that. And I didn't know, I'd say, well, maybe they have answers that I don't have. And then you coming back and going, no, they don't. They don't have answers like you have. And that just kind of validated me to a level. And again, I respect you as much as anybody. So you've always been straight and honest with me. If I was saying any bullshit, you're the king of calling out people on bullshit, right? And we know that there's so much bullshit out there right now that it's crazy. And I know it's making you a little manic at this point. So again, it's like my wife. I know, if there's one person that's going to tell me straight and not going to pull any punches, it's my wife, and that's you. So again, I appreciate it. I wouldn't want to share this completely with anybody else, and you've also been there and really helped me gain a lot of this information, because you've actually also been on the ground working with these kids and working with hundreds and thousands of kids, and kind of validating for me, saying, yeah, you're not the only one seeing this, I'm seeing it too.
Yeah, for me, it was really important to always sit in these courses, and we might see 50, 60, 70 to 100 people, but this is what I was bugging you about. Was
Yes.
Like, I just wanted you to get in a room with me and say, hey, let me ask you a bunch of questions, because I want the world to hear what I've heard for 20 some odd years. And I've gotten this to be the first person to see the evolution of it all.
Yeah.
And then you'd call me and say, hey, I got this idea for this concept paper, or I got this idea for a research study. What do you think? I'm like, yeah, let's get this thing done.
Yep.
And so now it's just trying to get it out to the masses for people to understand that what you've done is you've taken all these different fragments of concepts and now have brought it together to a theoretical model that you started over 20 years ago, and now said, okay, hey, guess what? We can actually truly change these children's lives. And now we're working with adults and changing their lives. And so it's just been a great ride.
Yeah, and it's a proven model, and that's the Melillo Method, and that's the whole point of this, is that, we have actually proven it. We haven't just gone out there saying it, but we've actually put it to the test, which is what I encourage, anybody to do. And being a pioneer in any area is, how you define a pioneer, by all the arrows in their back, right? So, I've been attacked, and people have said things and, whatever that, quack and things like that. But I knew the truth. I've known the truth all along. And the bottom line is, when we see the results every day in what we do, and we still see a lot of patients every day, that is what drives me. And I know it works. We know it works, and we've proven that it works. And it's only going to get better and, impact more people from here.
And I'm sure there had been such an amazing validation when the BMJ paper got published, because I know you'd been working towards getting published in higher Q1 journals, or journals that are at the highest level.
Yeah.
And I knew that it had to be a big thing for you.
Yeah, all of the papers as they came out, especially last year, I think we published 7 papers, and they were all in Q1 or Q2. So they're all in the top 1 or 2 tier level journals in the world. But the BMJ was the last one, and that was probably the highest one, with one of the biggest, impact factors out there. But we got a lot more coming out.
Yeah, and then the other component of this is the amount of researchers that are actually referencing you on papers. How many times do I send you a paper and say, hey, guess what? Who was the first reference in this paper? It was you
Yeah.
in your lab.
And we have some papers now that have been referenced 60, 100,000 times. And that's how you make an impact on science. People will come about and sometimes they'll say, well, how come I never heard of this? Or how come I never heard of you? How come nobody knows about it? Well, there are people that know about it, but, a lot of people, even most doctors, don't read a lot of papers. They don't know about research. They don't know about the brain. And, but when you're getting papers, one paper being referenced 60,000 or 100,000 times by other researchers, that's an impact. That means you're changing their research and you're making an impact. And that's in one paper. And, I have, I think, 100 publications or so.
Yeah, a little different than Instagram followers and likes on Twitter and stuff like that. So,
yeah. Well,
it's been my pleasure today to do this, and we're going to continue to do this because I know I have so many more questions that I want the audience to be able to hear, but it's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks. You've been great. Thank you. Love you, brother.
Love you too.
Okay. See you next time. Bye.